This world called Tannerland is different from the planet Earth, when the Emperor's heart is burned here. Someone who has defied fate will arrive in this land. A prophecy of a supernatural being came to Tannerland, and the ruler of the Lin Empire supported 5 sons, 7 daughters, and confidants to summon this supernatural being, but when he performed the summoning, he saw an ordinary guy in front of him. He was shocked that this was actually the person from the prophecy, since he had wasted his timid. It was not a deity, but an innocent child. He summoned an ordinary earthly guy and got angry, ordering him to get out of here. Sunan found himself all alone in an unknown land. Sometime earth walls of the Lazan Palace were stained with blood, and the Emperor begged for the supernatural deity to hear his call. A huge monster appeared next to him, but Sean was not afraid of it and swung his sword, activating conquer the sky and rumble the mountains. He easily defeated the monster, and lest Stad cursed because the protagonists dealt with these creatures too easily. These monsters were so dangerous because they did not obey the laws of this world. But for Xian, this was not a problem, because he was also not from this world. He was called the Unearthly Savior, and he announced that the powerful ability to summon creatures from another world was passed on only to the Lustin family, and also caused many deaths. Peaceful people suffered from the Emperor's tyranny, not to mention that Xian himself had to go through hell because of lust. Onad, the Emperor, decided that the one he summoned to this world was good for nothing, and got rid of him by putting him in the dungeon. He barely managed to escape, and years have passed since then, and he ended up here. He lived every month in the hope of one day raising the sword of justice. Over Lad's head he pointed the blade at him, warning him that his titani had come to an end. Now he was going to return Alth. Desperate pain and indignation of his fallen comrades, he swung, and Lustina only managed to curse, realizing fate for writhing would have been different if not for this damned prophecy. The next moment, a cut had already pierced his body, and he fell, and Xian put the sword back in its sheath. He looked at Lad's bloody body, finally realizing that it was all over. He sighed in relief, and at that moment he heard someone call out to him. He was glad when he realized it was Lavina, and she was happy since he had finally defeated the Emperor. She congratulated him, and the protagonist agreed with this, admitting that it was not easy. He hugged her, smiling happily since everything was behind him, and now there was nothing more to worry about. He was going to do everything to make Elva happy, and she wanted to answer him. Butch did not have time, because Lil Steam noticed that this was not all because they had to burn the Emperor's heart in order to get rid of the monsters. He thought that Sahan would not be able to do anything, but it turned out that he was capable of many things. That is why he did not cease to amaze him, and the protagonist joyfully shouted his name, and his other comrades praised him for his excellent work, but noted that he could disappear if they burn at the Emperor's heart. However, Sion was summoned by the hearts of his confidants, not the Emperor, and some of his comrades did not think that he could return to his world. This meant that the Emperor had summoned his killer, and this seemed to the protagonist's comrades. He suddenly asked them to listen to him, but before he finished, Elva sadly asked if Harali did not want to go home. He confirmed it because he had already made his decision. His deceased comrades, close friends, and the person he loved more than his life were in this world. He would be lying if he said he didn't miss land at all, but he didn't regret his choice to stay here, because it was here that everything he held dear was. Severian looked at him happily after these words, and Lilin noticed that Sean would not change his mind. He confirmed this, and then turned around because someone called out to him. Elva kissed him, and he was surprised by such a sudden impulse, and she suddenly admitted that it was hard. Her tone changed, and the protagonist was surprised, and then felt an energy. Theteros behind him. He turned around, realizing that this was a dimensional portal, and warned the others to be more careful, because someone had opened a portal. However, his comrades did not react in any way, and he noticed the burnt heart of the Emperor in the palm of one of his friends. He understood what it was, and his comrades asked him if he didn't know that even if the entire Lad dynasty perished, the Emperor's heart would still be accessible, and they would be able to open a portal to another world. Now Lilin held the ashes outstretched, warning that Sion had come too strong. The other boys added that he was too popular, too beloved, and that meant that he would soon rise above them, and they did not need another emperor. The protagonist had saved this world, and for that they were immensely grateful to him. But it was time for him to return home. The future of this world was now in their hands, and they were not going to give power to an outsider like Xian. He was outraged that they would say something like that and turn at Elva begging her for help, however she did not move, and this only shocked him more. She was sure that he needed to make this decision himself, and he shouted her name and she apologized. Because she did not want to be the emperor's wife, but wanted to be the empress. She did not want to be someone's decoration, but wanted decorations to lie at her feet. However, Sion was not fit to be her decoration, and so she approached him, running her finger along his chin. The protagonist still did not understand what was happening, and Lavina realized that it was not easy for him, but she decided to help him ease this pain. He tried to stop her, but she pushed him into the portal, telling him to return to his homeland. He, falling into the portal, saw the faces of his comrades for the last time and screamed. Soon, the energy off, the portal dissipated. The world was saved by the hero from another world and his Sixilies. A little later, they announced that the savior had fulfilled his role. They accepted his desire to return to Tohei's homeland and were ready to take care of the future of the empire, confident that their savior Xian would be proud. Optim. The emperor's reign was over, and now the empire could rely on them. The era of the 6 emperors was about to begin, and the people rejoiced when they heard this speech. Taxes were lowered in the empire, and the people were freed from hard work. The 6 emperors were in agreement and ruled the land of Tanner wisely. It was a carefree time. But some time later, the energy corresponding to the portal between dimensions rose in this world again. One day Alita walked out of her house, humming softly to herself. She admired how blue the sky was, and not a cloud in it, and assumed that no was the time to plow the field. She smiled happily, walked to her plot, and began to work. However, some time later, she was distracted because she heard some sound. A flounder fell near her, and she was very surprised, and then rejoiced that it was really alive. Flounder. It was delicious, but she realized that she couldn't eat it because she didn't even know where the fish came from. The fish couldn't do anything in the forest, so Alita put the flounder aside, deciding to continue working. But before she could get back to her work, something else fell behind her, and it was much heavier than the fish, so a cloud of dust rose in the air. She turned around in fear and saw a pig that had fallen to the ground with such force that it had made a dent underneath. Alita didn't understand what had happened, but she assumed that all these animals were falling from the sky, and then she saw Sean, who was also falling from the sky, screaming because I was completely naked. Alita frowned, but didn't have time to react in any way because the main character fell to the ground, raising a cloud of dust when it gradually dissipated. Alita was surprised that after the pig, a naked man fell. She was worried about Sion's condition as he fell headfirst on the ground and ran closer to him. However, he was alive and looked around, paying attention to the place he was in. Alita was surprised by such a reaction, but greeted Xian and hillowed happily, as after so many years, he finally succeeded and turned. However, the next moment he fell unconscious on the ground, and Alita asked herself in confusion, what was that? Sometime later, when it was already night outside, the protagonist abruptly opened his eyes, surprised that he was somewhere in the house. Alita noticed that he was already awake, and handed him the porridge she had prepared. She was curious about his well-being, because she did not expect him to fall from the sky. He realized that she had saved him, but he screamed. His whole body ached. The side effects were more severe than he thought, so he assumed he had miscalculated. Alita. He was a foreigner, as the way he spoke was the unofficial language of the land of Tanner. She assumed he was from some native tribe, although she noted that he was too pure for such a person. Xian suddenly realized that Hugh was not actually on Earth, and began to speak in another language, asking if Alita had saved him. She confirmed this and realized that he was not from the tribe. The protagonist then asked where it was. She explained that they were north of Mount Dylan, about hours from Goron village. Sean did not know where all of this was, and Alita suggested that they start by saying that they were in the Lilin Empire. It was a territorial unit formed by Emperor Lilith after the hero family revolution. The protagonist noticed that this was the Lilin Empire, which meant that he had pummed the emperor. He called him names, and for a while, both he and Alita were silent, and eventually, Xian asked her for some clothes, and she decided to give it to him soon. She began to feed him, and he emptied several bowls of food and thou. He noticed a strong fishy smell. He decided that nothing could be done about it, and assumed that there were spices here. He was glad that he finally returned, and suddenly he realized that he forgot to thank Elitan thanked her for the food. She was surprised by this, and then continued to observe the protagonist, noticing that he had a lean, muscular body, sharp facial features, and he behaved very rudely with her, for she assumed that he was from the nobility, but did not understand why, in this case, he did not have clothes. He suddenly realized that he had completely forgotten to ask the name of his savior, and Alita was surprised that he decided to ask about it now, but still said her name, adding that she was an ordinary village girl. Xian was surprised by this because he noticed that she was a swordswoman, and quite an experienced one at that. She did not understand why he decided this, and he honestly admitted that he simply assumed it since everything was too difficult to explain. Alita did not argue with the fact that she was a swordsman and owned a weapon, but she was not part of the knightly squad. Free swordsmen like her did not work for the emperor and technically lived off of individual orders. Personally, she was engaged in plant growing when there was no other work. The protagonist understood everything and Sudley asked what her relationship was to Emperor Lord. Alita froze, after which jerked sharply, knocking over the table. On Xian, he screamed, and she grabbed a dagger, jumping over the tableline, ordered to attack him, but he was no longer there, so she was very surprised. The protagonist appeared behind her, noting that he did not ask for a fight, and Alita asked in confusion how he got there. She turned around trying to attack him, but he easily dodged, and she assumed that he was also a swordsman. After that, she struck again, and Xian dodged again, and this happened several more times, but he still tried to convince Alita that he was not going to fight. He offered to talk, but she did not stop drawing attention to the fact that he was strong because he easily dodged her blows. In this case, it was necessary to speed up, and she really did it, but her blows still did not touch Xian, and he realized that she was not as meek as she seemed. However, she had a good heart, since she aimed for the shoulders and did not want to kill him. Another blow aimed at him. He stopped with a spoon, and Alita was especially surprised by this, fell to the ground, and Xian simply smiled, and eventually she gave in. She wondered who he was, and he introduced himself, saying that he came from Earth. Her eyes widened, assuming that he was the savior from another world. The protagonist was surprised that anyone still remembered him, and noted that he understood perfectly well why she attacked him. He asked her what the tyrant was to her, and he himself would have been offended if someone had asked him that. However, he was simply asking, so she did not have to answer. Still, she gave her full name, Ethor Bella Lad Lasan, admitting that she was the daughter of Emperor Lad. She remembered Ho. Some time ago, the rebellious people shouted that the reign of the tyrant emperor had come to an end, ordering a thirst to destroy the imperial family. They were not going to let the emperor's offspring ascend to the throne, and a thought time, Serafina apologized to Karen, saying that he was the only one she could rely on. He wanted to tell her something, but he paused for a moment, and then promised that he would protect the child with his own life. Alita, who was still very young at the time, looked at her mother desperately. After that, their bodyguard Karen took care of her, raised her away from people, and taught her how to fight. He was just doing his duty, but when her identity was accidentally revealed, he had to leave the Empire. Alita lived here since then, but sometimes she went outside the villa ghetto, run an errand. If she ran out of money, Sean realized that this was why she lived in such a remote place, and had never thought that he would meet the Emperor's daughter. He assumed that he was her father's enemy, but Alita Nollinger had any relation to him because he was dead. And yet people were still afraid that someone would take his place. Members of the imperial family were able to open dimensional portals, so they were hunted, and she thought that Sean was the killer. The protagonist was angry that his former comrades thought that he wanted to get rid of the Emperor's relatives, but did not bother to check this, and simply lied to him. The more he learned about what happened, the angrier became, but he was sure that Alita should not be sad, although it was not easy for her now, since sometimes good people like him fell from the sky. Alita did not answer, and then she asked with disbelief if he was really a savior from another world. She heard that after killing the Emperor he returned to Earth, and so she did not understand how he managed to get to Tanner. In addition, she wondered why he returned without clothes, and Sean shouted that such things are not under his control. The whole thing was later that only a living organism can pass through the portal, and not in strange fetishes. When he got here for the first time, he was also naked, and even when he returned to Earth years ago in the middle of Guangweiman Square, everything was the same. He did not even want to remember this, and Alita was interested in what he said about Guangwaman, since she did not know about it. Finally, she realized that he returned to Earth years ago and came to Tanner at someone's call. She could not believe that someone could summon a person from another world, since no one except the Imperial family was capable of this. The protagonist explained that if you think about it like that, then it was him, because he returned on his own. Alita was shocked that he called himself and did not understand if this was possible. Of course it was not easy, and Sean needed years, although he did not do it entirely on his own. Suddenly his eyes widened, turning around sharply, and Alita wondered what was going on. He remembered that she had said that she was being pursued because she had Thimperer's blood in her, which allowed her to summon beings from another world. This was indeed true, and suddenly cursed Bess. He realized that he had been mistaken. He, noticing Alit's lack of understanding, explained that in order to get to Tanner, he needed to find a magical support for safe travel. He used the power of the Emperor's relatives, while were able to open a spatial portal, and Alita had the purest blood. Then she realized that this was why he asked her what her relationship was to the Emperor. In other words, the protagonist used Hera as a converter, and this meant that everyone would see that she had summoned him with magic. Alita was horrified, assuming that this could not be, and then stood up abruptly, approaching the window, and noticed the torches of the approaching people, not understanding how this was possible. And when they had time, the knights were already near her house. The clan announced that they had detected traces of magic here, and he was sure that it was coming from the hut. He assumed that everyone was ready for a siege, and attracted the attention of the knight Xenon's stride. He decisively thanked him for his help, and Thénardier everyone to prepare for an invasion, as well as to stay close during the encirclement of the building. Side watching everything that was happening, Side and Alita, coming closer to him, resolutely stood up, clutching a sword in her hands. The protagonist noticed that she was already accustomed to difficulties, and assumed that she had been preparing for this her entire life. He felt sorry for her being forced to suffer because of him, because she hid for so many years, and now everything was revealed in his thoughts. She was cursing at him because she had gotten caught because of him. He assumed that she was very angry even if she did not show it, and so he asked her not to be afraid, to speak up if she really wanted to say something. Alita looked at him in surprise, and then thanked him for warning her about the siege in advance. This greatly surprised Zan, and he asked again in shock. But before Alita could swear, the knights began shouting, ordering her to show herself, because if she did, her hut would be blown to pieces. Xenon suggested that the clan start with a light attack, and he cast a spell called the Burning Pike. A powerful flame engulfed the house, and Xenon was very surprised, assuming that this was too powerful an attack since they had Tobering Alita alive. The clan explained that the fire was only that strong outside, so she would not be harmed. Beautif. She was unlucky. She would be left with several burns. The knights near the house looked at the flames and Shotan. The next moment, Alita jumped out of it, and they ran to attack. Noticing her, whoever could catch Alita could get gold coins. However, before the knights got close, she swung her sword, inflicting wounds on them, and everyone realized that she was a swordsman. However, Alita realized that there were too many knights, so she would not be able to fight back. She flinched as the attack flew towards her, and from this, she had to jump back. Xenon was outraged that Alita, whom he called a name, dared to kill a normal soldier. He assumed that she should be very ashamed, and promised that he would take revenge on her for this. She was scared, noticing that he had magical armor, because it meant that Hua's a level stronger than her. Xenon launched an attack, and she barely dodged. She managed to avoid another blow as well, and found the right time to attack, striking, but the armor where she struck glowed, reflecting the attack. Xenon noticed that she had a high-level sword, but his equipment was also stronger and more durable than Alita thought, and Sasek others would not work against him. He struck, throwing her aside, and she coughed. Blood sprayed from her mouth, and the force of her landing on the ground caused dust to rise into the air. Xeno frowned, displeased by how dusty it wasn't. Alita was surprised by his strength, and noticed that her arm was broken. Xeno warned her that if she really was a swordsman, she should know that she did not stand a chance. He wanted to tell her what would happen if she simply laid down her weapon, but before he could finish, she gave up. He thought it was Agarat's decision, and was glad that she understood quickly. He wanted to continue his speech, but suddenly, someone called out to him. Sion was unhappy that Xenon had been so heartless all this time, and now he decided to pity Alita. He felt like his mood was changing too quickly, and Xenon was very surprised to see him. He wondered who the protagonist was, since he was so close, but he did not sense his presence. He asked him who he was. He swung his sword without waiting for an answer, and Xian apologized to him, warning him that it was nothing personal. Still, he had to take action, so he turned it around, and Xenon's eyes widened. And the next moment, the protagonist punched him, throwing him high into the air. Xenon fell stuck in the ground, and all the knights were afraid that Xian slammed him into the ground, like that. Alita was wondering why the protagonist was against these warriors, since these guys were supposed to be his former comrades. Clan noticed that Xian was part of the Devil Empire, and ordered the others to get rid of him right away. He looked thoughtfully at the knights running towards him, surprised that they were not going to retreat, even after the death of their commander. In this case, he had no choice, and although he did not want to, he entered the battle. He, throwing the soldiers in different directions, asked them not to be offended by him, and not to be angry. He continued to apologize, since they did not really want to do it, and this only made the knights more terrified, begging him to stop apologizing if he was going to kick their asses in the end. After some time had passed, Xenon managed to get up, screaming in pain. He called Siona's name and then suddenly shuddered when he saw the state of the other knights. He assumed that it was impossible, since an unarmed man had single-handedly dealt with an entire army. He assumed that this was how he had looked a foot ago and remarked that he was lucky, but suddenly he recognized those movements, remembering the hero from Thepist, because it reminded him of him at the moment. Xian noticed that he was awake, and admitted that he was quite strong. He apologized to him, warning him that he needed to sleep a little more, and Xenon looked at him in horror, trying to make him stop. The protagonist concentrated energy near him himself, preparing to strike, and before Xenon finished speaking, he slammed him into the ground. He repeated that it was nothing personal, and suggested that the soldiers live in peace. However, he also warned that they would be in trouble if they raised a hand against him. The clan watched in horror as the army was defeated, since neither the knights nor the mages could do anything to Xian, heckled him a devil swordsman, and wondered where he came from. The protagonist, meanwhile, approached Alita, assuming that the knights were no longer a threat. He noticed that she was still sitting in one place and asked if she would be here all day. She was not going to do so, and tried to get up, and then they began to leave. Together, the clan realized that the mission had failed, and noticed that Xenon had been defeated. They had to retreat, and he ordered their remaining knights to take care of the bodies of the dead. However, no one died, and the knights were simply stuck in the ground. This only made the clan more amazed, certain that such a thing could not be. It seemed impossible to him. There were no casual in this fierce battle, and he did not understand what just happened. After some time had passed, Sedand, Xian and Alita had gone deeper into the forest. The protagonist finally announced that the knights would not find them here. He felt relieved, as he didn't want the knights to follow him. Side effects of the spatial shift were stronger, and his combat energy was now at N, and his mana was negligible compared to his previous level. He wondered how long it would take him to return to his previous form, but was distracted by Alita groaning in pain. He noticed that she had broken her arm, and she sighed, but realized that she was very lucky, because in reality, it could have been much worse. Despite this, she was shaking in pain, and Xian did not understand why she was happy about it. She seemed strange to him, and yet he soon made a bandage for her, hoping that it would help. Alita thanked him, but he had no problem with helping. She decided that in this case it was time for her to go, and began to leave, and the protagonist asked in confusion where she was going. He assumed that they should go together, and also didn't understand how she was going to get out of the forest with a broken arm. She calmly she would just be careful, but it wouldn't help in the end. Xian decided that he would help her, since he would be partly to blame for what happened, and besides, he couldn't afford to leave a wounded person. Alita thought about it then agreed, and decided to trust him. In this case, Xian was shocked that she thought for so long before saying this, and then he told her to call him by his first name. She immediately agreed, and he asked what she was going to do next. This question was related to the fact that she was exposed, so it was not safe to stay here. She thought about it, remembering that the closest village was Gorum, but they were most likely already looking for her there. That is why they were going to just cross the mountain, and then get to the trading city of Kagan. Sometime later, in the palace of Lilin Empire, the first ruler of the Lilin Empire was studying a book, but was distracted by someone Wakatsu's attention, a servant informed him that news had arrived from a detachment from Mount Defin, Lilin Vascurius. About what had happened a little while later, he went down from the library to the dungeon and used magic tupin. The door then went further into a room where there were a large number of books and various experimental instruments. Before Lilin could do anything, he heard someone calling him. He turned around looking at the man who had admitted to hating him. He was outraged that he still called himself a hero. After that, he sat on a magic circle chained to the wall, and Lilin noticed that these 2 weeks had not done him any good. He did all this to him because he was a descendant of Lusklan, and suddenly he asked the man if he knew why the color of the magic circle under his feet changed color. The green color signaled the completion of the magical transformation process. The man felt sorry for Lilin's subjects, but he felt sorry for someone else, namely the one who was about to lose his heart. The man froze in fear, not understanding what was happening, and the next moment, Lil Stein tore the heart out of his chest. After that, he burned it, but realized that it was not enough. Gathering power from distant relatives was almost meaningless, because it was not enough to break the spatial barriers, as he thought he needed a closer relative of Thimperer. And he remembered that his assistants told him that the mission had failed. They were struck down by an unknown man who had dark hair and black eyes, and looked like a representative of the gallant race. He imagined a person matching the description, and that person was Sean. However, he pulled himself away from these thoughts because Xian could not cross the dimensional gate, and it was simply impossible. Sometime later, the protagonist and Alita had already arrived in Kagan City, and Sean was surprised by this. Previously, when this city was part of one empire, at Waskald South Sinam, he did not even immediately realize that this was the same city. In fact, he missed it very much since he lived here in the past, and Alita was surprised by this. The protagonist confirmed this, remembering that this city was a center of trade, and explained that it was easy to hide here due to the large flow of people there. Also, a race of Jin and its representatives were very similar to Northern Asians. She did not understand what he was talking about, and then assumed that the rumors about imitators were true. She realized that he was talking about the Empress's power of 1,000 forms. This ability allowed you to use combat energy to change your appearance. Even the slightest change was able to make a person look like someone else. This unique skill belonged to Empress Lina, as well as stealth. Xian noted with displeasure that it was he who invented this skill and taught it Tolva. He offered to teach this to Alita too, since it would make it easy for her to hide, but she had no reason to ask for his help, and he reminded her that they had become closer. Still, he did not continue this conversation and offer Rito find a place to stay. In fact, Alita would like to learn this skill, since she saw John completely differently. A little later, the protagonist brought her to one of the places where she could spend the night and asked her opinion about it. She said that he knew this inn, and he explained that this was not so. So since there used to be no building there, but a gallows. Alita was horrified when she heard this, and Sean imagined this gallows. Noticing that this place had changed a lot, he recognized Tanner, and then offered to go to this inn since they had already come. Alita was scared, assuming that there could be ghosts there, but Sean did not calm her down, since if there were ghosts then he would be able to see his old comrades there eventually. They entered the hotel, and after the necessary contract was concluded, the owner handed them the key. He was very tired of the service industry, and was very angry, and the protagonist did not understand the reason for this. Alita later explained why this happened, and Sean was horrified when he realized that he had been disrespectful to this man all the time. Alita confirmed this warning that no matter how legendary a hero Sean was, one should not forget about the rules of decency. She herself did not mind, but the man at the reception was much older than the protagonist. He understood that Alita was right, but this was because he almost never communicated formally in his native language, and so he habitually began to address everyone as acquaintances. He realized that he was rude to Alita too, but she warned that it was late, and so she offered to communicate. As before, Sion was very sorry about this, but she warned him that there were more important things to do since they had already reached Kagan. She wondered what he was going to do next, and he told her that he needed to settle in, so he planned to stay with Alita. For a while he wondered if she would be against it, and she said that she really did not agree. He thought it was rude, but Alita told him that she was not the only person in this city, and besides, she was a wanted person, This meant that it would be worse for the protagonist if he stayed with her, and if he continued. Whether she would have to question every time why she agreed. She was sure that he understood that she had no good. Ria Santo, take him with her. She had admitted that this was true, but there was something else, and he did not want to say it. But no, he had no choice. The thing was that without him, Alita would be caught right away, and she was amazed, and he explained that if you use magic to summon someone from another world, the energy of the transition will be very strong. No one summoned him. He came on his own, so most likely no one in this world knows about his appearance. However, the magic off crossing the gate of the dimension leaves certain traces, so every time they move, a small amount of energy is released, causing vibrations. While they were leaving traces, they continued to be chased, and Alita was horrified that they were still leaving traces, since this meant that escaping was completely pointless. Sion reassured her because yesterday he had only arrived, so he could not do anything, but now he had already blocked the vibrations with magic. While the magic was active, no one would find them, but the magic had to be renewed. Every days now, Alita understood why she needed him, but she wondered why he needed her, a question that surprised Xian. Sometime later, in the capital of Delry, Lustan Empire, Xenon begged to be allowed to restore his honor. He was going to clear his name, and promised in Darwin that he would get those damned wicked people at any cost, and Darwin thought about it, and then asked if Xenon really thought that was the point. The thing was, even the Emperor had not punished those responsible for the mission's failure, and Xenon was going to return to the battlefield with an inexperienced army, but he was sure that a knight who failed to carry out an order could not be forgiven, and he believed that a true knight must clear his tarnished name, and Darwin was amazed that he had not forgotten what a true knight was, and in the end he allowed him to restore his own honor. Xenon left thinking that these people would need money to survive, and they were both swordsmen, so they would most likely work on occasional assignments. They were heading to the trade city of Kargan, and there was only one job opportunity there, so he decided to pretend to be a customer and find out what assignment they had accepted. Now he needed to track them down, but he really had little interest in the Emperor's family and wanted to check out the unknown guy he had met. No matter how he looked, he forgot that he looked too much like a savior from another world, and though it was impossible, he still assumed that it was him. He needed to confirm this for himself. Sometime later, Ted Barcelona returned to the mansion, and Lure greeted him. Ted thanked him for that. Anthon noticed the people he had spoken of. They were the hired swordsmen Kargan had spoken of, namely Alita Relin and Schonstein. Alita was surprised when she noticed that the protagonist had settled on the name Sean, and he explained Thoth had simply chosen a similar name, so that if she accidentally said his real name, no one would notice. Lured told Ted that they were both swordsman warriors who could use fighting energy, were divided into 6 ranks. This was the Zera rank, and these fighters were able to use fighting energy to increase the level of physical characteristics. The warrior rank was able to imbue iron with fighting energy and create special weapons, and most swordsmen possessed rank. Those who reached the knight rank were able to imbue equipment with fighting energy, and those who reached the master rank were able to imbue any weapon with fighting energy, including non-metal ones. Those who were able to imbue air with energy to create a blade possessed the god rank. However, in the history of Tanner there were only a few people who were able to completely control fighting energy, and Sean was among them. He had once reached the rank of a deity, but due to the spatial displacement, he had lost his combat and magical energy. He was disappointed Thoth was now at such a low rank, since he was a warrior rank, but Ted thought it was amazing for such a young guy. He was happy to welcome them here. Their party was leaving tomorrow, and now they needed to gain strength. Sion soon fell tiredly onto the bed, since earning money was very difficult, and being a mercenary fighter was not easy. If everything was as before, he would simply rob the nearest estate. Alita was surprised that the heroes also steal, and the protagonist said that the girl he loved was a thief. It was a love story of people from different worlds, and it was a dangerous love, and yet they did not steal for nothing because it had a serious justification. All the nobility of the empire in those days was very evil, but now it would be difficult to pull off, and this meant that there was no choice, and he would have to earn an honest living by cutting people and splashing their blood. Alita warned that people would think differently if they heard this wording, and Sun, meanwhile, thought about the assignment, assuming that there was some kind of monster there. This was indeed the case, because a pack of Ignis wolves formed near Barcelon. The detachment was already being assembled, but they did not succeed due to a lack of fighters, and therefore was decided to hire IND dependent swordsman. The protagonist hadn't seen fire-spitting wolves in a long time and remembered that years ago, the first monsters he had to face were also these wolves, and he and his friends had driven them out of the forest. When he thought about his friends, his thoughts flashed back to their last moment together. Winthy had pushed him out of this world, into the portal. He frowned, but he shook off these thoughts, assuming that this task would be just the right time to warm up, and he would just gain some fighting energy. Alita wondered if he was her that he had lost all his strength since he had defeated her with a wooden spoon and had easily dealt with a squad of knights. Sihan had said the same thing since he had needed a spoon to defeat Alita, and that made him much weaker. He might be right, but it was driving Alita crazy. The protagonist noted that lack of energy he still had experience, because even if the international champion was lower in level, it did not mean that he would lose in battle. Alita did not understand what he was talking about, but he did not explain, but simply suggested that she lie down and return to her room. When the morning came, Ted warned that the monsters would pay for daring to encroach on his territory. He told the monsters to attack if they were not afraid, and promised that he would defeat them all with his own hands. The knights supported him, and Sion watched this with displeasure. Ted was covered in iron from head to toe, and against the Ignis wolves, it was useless. This equipment was very heavy, and the protagonist noted that the knights had not changed at all since Ethan. Elle did not answer him, and he was interested in the condition of her hand thanks to the fighting energy. She felt much better, and Sean was glad to hear this, and then ordered her to prepare for battle. She was surprised, and Hicks, that he smelled a sulfurous odor at that moment. One of the men was distracted by a rustling sound, and then her screamed as a monster jumped out of the bushes. Ted ordered everyone to stop and prepare for an attack, as it was a pack of Ignis wolves. The monsters were coming at them, and Ted ordered them to approach, as their flame were nothing against the knight's blade. As soon as he finished speaking, the monster struck him, and he fell, and Sion explained that this was why it was necessary to remove the armor, as it was necessary to dodge. In this case, he did not understand how Theblade would help Ted, if he even chose the wrong equipment. The rest of the warriors, meanwhile, entered the fight with the wolves, telling each other not to run away as they were bound to win due to the fact that this time they had hired swordsmen with them. Sean had already destroyed one of the wolves by this time, but he realized that Thea's people were weaker than he thought. He could have dealt with the entire pack on his own, but he wasn't going to do it because it would have attracted too much attention. It seemed incredible to him that these people actually needed help against such monsters. The knights were running away because they had noticed a slightly different creature. They soon realized that it was the leader of the Ignan wolves, and Sean noticed that this was the main thing here. In that case, he knew what they had to do. He stood in front of the monsters, and then smiled. When the knights began to run past him, Ted ordered everyone to stop panicking because this was their chance, and if they got rid of the leader of the pack, the rest of the wolves would lose their will to fight. He decided to leave all this to Xian and Alita, and he himself was going to protect the soldiers. The protagonists did not answer him, realizing that they got all the dangerous work. Being a hired hand was very hard. He left the leader with Alita, and he himself was going to make sure that the other beasts did not come close. She was surprised by his continuation, and he admitted that he did not really want to run away because they could handle several fire wolves. One of the monsters tried to attack them, but Xian killed it with one blow, after which he told Alita to act. She resolutely agreed, running towards the leader, but it opened at its mouth, directing a stream of energy towards her. She managed to dodge to the side, swung her sword, and struck, and from this the monster screamed in anger. Alita remained focused and attacked again, and Xian noticed that she was strong, and knew that there was no need to worry about the leader. But his eyes widened as electrical discharges began to emanate from the monster's body, and Alita was afraid, and the next moment, one of the especially strong electrical discharge hit her, throwing her to the side. The wolf grabbed Alet with its teeth, and the protagonist excitedly shouted her name. He remembered how he thought about it when she asked why he needed her. In the end, he decided to be honest to avoid misunderstandings in the past. He was summoned by sacrificing the hearts of nobles, and because of this, he was a Blotto stay in Tanner. despite the will of the Emperor. However, this time, he came in a way that was more like a summoning than a sacrifice, so that connection with the summoner was the guarantee of his existence in this world. In other words, would return to Earth again if Alita died, so he ran after the leader to save Alita. She lost consciousness, and she cursed, because he did not have enough combat energy to speed up at the same time as he continued to run. The energy consumed, and he remembered he waited years to get here, and was ready to fall naked from the sky. The main thing was to end up in Tanner. That's why he was angry that he could go back. Because of something like that, he concentrated her gi near his sword using the energy of the dragon sword and directed an attack towards the beast. The monster was distracted by the flash of energy, and Sean concentrated, then sighed, noticing the splash of blood next to him. The wolf dropped Elliot from its mouth, and the protagonist lay down next to her on the ground, glad that they were alive. He tried not to overexert himself and almost went back home because of it. Sometime later, they made a fire and sat next to it, and Xian asked Ali how it felt. She was bitten by the beast, and so he was worried that she might be in pain somewhere. Alit's whole body ached, but she said that the leader did not want to kill her. She did not even know that Thiefru wolves have a tradition of giving living people to the leader. She was shocked that she, the highest swordswoman, was mistaken for food, and Sihan laughed. It was the first time they both saw a firewolf that struck lightning, and assumed it was a mutation. However, they killed it, so everything was fine for now. Alita thought for a while, and then called out to Xian. Since she did not need it before, but since they became allies, she needed to know something. Xian heard why he was revealing his true identity, since the 6 kingdoms were countries built by his comrades, and wherever he went, he would be welcomed. The protagonist admitted that he would be lucky if he was not executed, since they stabbed him in the back and forcibly sent him to Earth with the magic of return as soon as he killed the Emperor. It had only happened for a few minutes, but he remembered it so clearly. Even though years had passed, he could not understand his former comrades, and still did not know why they betrayed him. Neither of them hesitated at all, which meant that it was not a hasty decision. He did not understand what he was thinking, and how he could not see through his true intentions after so many years of being together. Alita was silent for a while, and Sean assumed that she was in shock, sure that she would be punished because now she was involved in a conflict against all the countries of Tanner. She realized that he had returned for revenge, and that was why he hid his true identity. The protagonist assumed that she could have misunderstood him, but she understood everything and did not understand such a reaction. Sean did not know why she was so calm, because he had practically declared war on all 6 kingdoms of Tanner. However, all of these kingdoms were already enemies of Alatand. She had been fighting against Tanner for the past years. No one gave her a choice, but she did everything she could. The protagonist noticed that she was hopelessly positive, and she remembered that her father often said that to her. Sean assumed that she was talking about the Emperor, but she got angry since she was not talking about that psycho. Viewed about her real father. Karen, the protagonist, did not answer her since he flinched, having felt something. He told her to wait, since something was heading that way, and looked towards, assuming that it was an enemy, but Xian did not want to believe it, since he did not understand why someone would send people to look for them. He assumed that it was one of the lost Berlon squads, but he warned them not to let their guard down. He was Abato voiced his guest about this, and at that time Xenon came out from behind the bushes, apologizing to them, so he wanted to ask them on the way. Xian and Alita froze, surprised that it was him, and realized that it was a spy from Lilin Hela. At them in confusion, he did not understand what they wanted to say. But before he could say anything, Alita pulled out her sword, attacking him. He screamed, dodging, and asked them to wait. Since he did not want to fight, Chon appeared behind him, concentrated energy near his palm, and noticed that Xenon did not want to attack. But he was going top at him to sleep for a while. He threw him into the air with one blow, and he paying attention to the skill. Realized thought he was right. He managed to minimize the effect of the skill on his body, stopping his flight, and the protagonist was surprised. Xenon soon landed nearby, and Xian asked in confusion, how did he manage to kill it? He used this skill when he was a child, so very few people knew about this skill, even among his old comrades. That's why he was curious. Ubo too. Xenon was, and he didn't answer right away, but he thought that he was sure of something. Now he suddenly put his hand in his bag, and the protagonist became wary when he noticed this. movement, but the next moment, his weariness was replaced by surprise, as Xenon suddenly turned away, showing the item he took out on his outstretched palms. He assumed that these panties belonged to Xian, and he, as well as Alita, froze in shock. Xenon pleased, and the protagonist displeased, ordered Alita to kill him. After all, he was just a pervert. Xenon asked him to wait, sure that this was a misunderstanding. He got nervous and said the first thing that came to his mind. However, Xian himself noticed that they were panties, so he told Alita to kill Xenon. He shouted that he surrendered, and the protagonist asked in displeasure why he was waving his underwear instead of a white flag. If he was going to surrender, repeated his order to Alita again, deciding to help her kill Xenon, but suddenly he fell silent, noticing a stripe on the waistband of his underwear. It was in Korean, and Xian also recognized his own handwriting, unrealized that it was indeed his underwear. Xenon confirmed this, asking if it was true that he was a savior from another world. His eyes did not deceive him, but the protagonist did not seem impressed, since he did not have even 1,000th of his energy right now. Xenon assumed that he remembered him, and told him that he was a child he saved years ago. He reminded him that he was from Barren Village, and Xian thought about it, and Xenon told him that he finished off all the Imperial soldiers who attacked their village with that skill. Thanks to this, Xenon was saved, and it was only after some time that he learned that his benefactor was a savior from another world. When he began to use fighting energy and became a swordsman, he learned the art of nullifying the attack power that the protagonist showed. Then it was a thoughtful skill to avoid unnecessary casualties, which showed Sun's consideration for other people, and so he was especially admired by him. Now the protagonist remembered that back then he only wanted to test the new skill, but he did not talk about it, since everyone had different views on it. However, he suddenly noticed that Xenon was the child he saved years ago. This meant that he was younger than Xian, and Xenon revealed that he had recently turned. He looked very mature in the protagonist's opinion, and he declared that appearance was only one side of a person, and it was what was inside that determined a person's worth. Xian wondered where he got that cheesy phrase from, and Xenon reminded him that it was a quote from the protagonist himself. He was a middle school student back then, and now he was surprised that he was like that. Still, Xenon's respect was understandable, but he found it strange that he carried his underwear around with him. He asked him to hide it, but he exclaimed that it wasn't just underwear. He had a Xian figurine that was exactly like that moment, and he also had numerous books and drawings of him. He collected everything that had to do with him, and the protagonist was shocked by this information. Xenon, meanwhile, added that his underwear was special because he wore it during the battle with the Mad Emperor. Lad Xenon was lucky enough to get it at an auction, and has spent half a year's salary on it. Xian understood everything, and asked Xenon to put the underwear back in the bag. He actually listened this time, and then declared that he had sworn to serve the Lil Steen family, because the king was Xian's comrade. He knelt down, holding out his sword as he wanted to use his weapon to serve the protagonist's nose, and thought about it, wondering what he would do if he considered the Lil Steen family his enemies in that case. Xenon would also think the same way, and the protagonist noticed his gaze, knowing that he was serious. In the end, he agreed because if Xenon knew who Xian was, he still couldn't let him go so easily. He accepted his sword, and he smiled happily, promising that he would do his best and not disappoint him. He was also about to destroy all the remaining fire wolves, but the protagonist noticed that they had already finished everything themselves. He pointed to the leader off to the side, but Xenon reminded him that fire wolves always come in pairs. He thought that they used the M's corpse as bait for the female, and these words made Xenon freeze in shock, and then ask again, in fear. The next moment, they heard a loud roar, and realized that everything happened just in time, as another monster appeared next to them, which was Mucklerger. Then the other leader of the pack, Sean, realized that if fire wolves walked in pairs, and it was not surprising that there were two leaders in the pack. He did not understand why he did not think of this, and Alita was unhappy there that such an experienced person did not know elementary things. However, this happened because a large number of years had passed, and for example, an adult after graduating from high school would not be able to solve the equation right away, and there was the same logic here. Alita was surprised since she did not know what an equation was, but Sean decided that it did not matter, since she would not have understood it anyway. Xenon asked the protagonist to let him handle this, and he was going to show what he could do. Sion allowed him to do so, and Xenon stood in front of the wolf, thinking that he had the chance to work with the hero. He had tried to look up to his entire life, and also protect him. However, he did not make a good impression, having been slammed into the ground twice, and he was not happy about it, so he now concentrated a large amount of energy near you, intending to show his true strength. This time and gained Sean's recognition. Alita was amazed by his fighting energy, but the protagonists did not seem impressed, not understanding why. Xenon was putting in so much effort. The wolf prepared to attack, and Xenon directed his own magical energy towards it, and screamed. He struck several times, and it seemed stunning to Alita, as Zenon fought back against the giant beast without receiving a single scratch. This meant that he would easily defeat her in a fight, and suddenly Sean noticed that Alita was very strong for her age, but Xenon was also quite good. He had several talents, and Alita was indignant, because in her opinion, it was not just several talents. She was annoyed by geniuses. The protagonist explained that there were many talented people around him, suggesting that he had inflated expectations. He himself was not a genius, but rather an exception, because he was an earthling. Lavina, for example, was a real genius, but Alita did not respond to this remark. Wolf, meanwhile, concentrated fire near his mouth, and then directed the flames towards Xenon. He cut it with his sword, warning that this fire will not even scratch him. He jumped, preparing to deliver the finishing blow, and warned that this is the end. Lita suddenly became afraid, and Sion noticed the wolf's position, and the next moment a bolt of lightning pierced Xenon and he fell to the ground. They all felt Giovanni. Alita was terrified that she fell as shamefully. Xenon didn't understand why the fur wolf was beating with lightning, and Alita suggested that she figure it out herself, but Sion decided to join the battle himself, because he could work with magic better than anyone here. Alita remembered this because he was from another world. The thing is that the Imperial army of monsters was feared, not only because of strength, because otherworldly creatures could not be damaged by magic, and it did not matter how strong the magician was. This law also applied to Sean, who came from another world, so now he stood in front of the wolf. The monster sent fire in his direction, but the protagonist did notice and think to defend himself because it did not work with him. Absolute immunity too. Magic last time helped him succeed, and he had to pretend to run away because of the large number of extra eyes. However, the lightning bolt set by the wolf still struck him, and he was terrified because of it. He was angry, and also did not understand why the magic worked on him. This had never happened before, but he distracted himself from his indignation, turning towards the wolf that had disgraced him in anger. He swung his sword, cutting the monster in two, and when the monster fell to the ground, Xian thought because the fire did not affect him earlier, and that was why he did not understand why the lightning bolt hit him. The next moment, Xenon ran up to him, worried about his condition, but the protagonist did not respond to his concern, but simply asked him to call him by his name, since they met him on Fentnet. Xenon tried to refuse, since he could not do something like that, but before they could continue talking, Abuti, the wolf's body, was engulfed in light, gradually beginning to dissolve. Everyone was very surprised by this, and Shenanigans admitted that he did not understand what it was. Sometime later they returned to Ted, and he was happy that they had survived. Now their lands were free of monsters, and it was all thanks to them. He paid them pieces of silver, and as Xian and Alita left the estate, the protagonists thought about how they would need more money in the future. However, getting such a sum for one task was already good, and it meant that if they completed all the difficult tasks, they would completely get rid of money problems. However, such tasks were not given every day, because this time, they were just lucky. Alita's words really made sense, and at this time, Xenon came closer to them. Curious about how everything went, he noticed that they said that they needed money, and showed a bag that contained gold coins. She and Alita were very surprised by this, and they wondered where he got such money. He sadly lowered his head, crying, and explained that he sold the Savior's artifact, that is the panties. The protagonist, noticing Xenon's disappointed state, realized that he had asked in vain, and added that if it would help Sean then he wouldn't mind. Alita thought about it, realizing that Sean's underwear could be sold for a lot of money, but he ordered her not to even think about it since this thing weighs not because he wore it, but because it was limited edition. Zenon was distracted from this topic of discussion, since he was interested in what the protagonist was planning to do. Now Thismany should be enough for now, and there was no need to work. As mercenaries for a while, Sion had 3 options, but he had not yet decided which one to choose. There was one place that would not be difficult to conquer, but suddenly, he fell silent, noticing something, and laughed, since he would soon see the face of a person he knew before. Alita and Zenon looked at him in bewilderment, and he decided that their destination would be the north and the kingdom of Jacksongard. Soon, in a laboratory in the kingdom of Lilithron contacted King Lilin. Through magic, it had been a while since they had seen each other, but it was still not time for a scheduled report, so Lilin did not understand Witherin contacted him. He explained that they would not need to hire anyone for test subjects, and as the kingdom of Barcelon had taken care of it themselves. Lilin was surprised that this was true, but he still admitted that these test subjects were not very strong, but there was more to it than that, as they had also lost test subject tone. This only further surprised Lil Stein, and also angered him, and he asked again, assuming that Thrawn had gone completely crazy. He did not understand what they were being paid for, and asked how he could call himself the head of the Blue Ivory Tower. The thing is, there were for magic towers in Tanner for 1,000 years, which included the red, white, blue, and black ivory towers. The first emperor of the Lin Kingdoms was the most powerful mage in history, and he collected all the knowledge and wisdom from the mages of all of Tanner, and placed the records in the 4 towers. This was divided into classes, and placed it in different floors and so on. One of these levels, the mages learned their level of magic. As they advanced in their magic skill, they would go up to the next floor to study, and that meant that floor showed the EMS skill. Lilin himself, waist head of the red Ivory Tower on the 9th floor, he was too furious about what happened, and warned that the only reason Tron was in such a high position was because more suitable candidates were executed. He suggested that Tron was expecting to be fired since he was only worthy of the 8th floor. At most, he gave him one last chance, ordering him to quickly deal with test subject number 1 and cover his tracks. He immediately agreed, promising that he would not let Lin down this time. When the communication session was ended, he sighed, glad that he was at least given another chance soon. In the capital of Ratton's Cell, in the kingdom of Vev Jackson, Guard the Squire reached one of the rooms in the palace and approached Jacksongard. Rothenberg, who was interested in the reason for his visit, invited him in for a glass of alcohol. But he was not at all happy about Jacksongard throwing another party. But Halad, asking if a man could be happier, the days when the Empire was hunting Hymno seemed like a distant dream, but the squire warned that in the eternal feast and celebration, Jacksongard forget about political matters. He was afraid that this could lead to his authority among the people being shaken. But Jacksongard warned him not to be afraid, because he was not a bad ruler. After all, it was not he spent money from his own pocket, but the squire was dissatisfied, because it was the taxes of Jacksongard's people. Jacksongard added that he did not have a percent tax like the previous emperor, but the squire thought that his tax was percent. In addition, Jacksongard did not burn hundreds of villages, forcing tens of thousands of people to become slaves, but he punished hundreds of villages, and also forced tens of thousands of people to join the army, and yet the squire did not say anything out loud. And Jacksongard suggested that Hestel deserved this small reward for overthrowing the previous emperor. He reminded him that this emperor was very cruel, and asked how he could be compared to him. After all, the poor had no choice, and squire wanted to argue, but Jacksongard cut him off, assuming he couldn't take a hint. The squire was scared by his menacing appearance, and fell silent. Low bear. Bowing and leaving, he knew that Jacksongard had gone too far. He had the ability to fight, but he had no management skills, and it would be great if there was someone who could make him take responsibility. All of Jacksongard's good humor had evaporated, as he had been having a good time, but now it was ruined. Supposed he should fire Squire, but before he could think about it any further, another of his subordinates entered the room, calling him the savior of the world and the hero of all heroes. He was honored to meet him, and Jacksongard was immediately pleased when he recognized his visitor. As the Duke of Katron, he apologized for disturbing him, but there was something that needed Jacksongard's attention. He thought it was no big deal, since he had always liked Keltron. Keltron handed him some papers that he needed to sort out, and Jackson. Guard took it, and actually looked at the papers for a while, but then he threw it away. Since he didn't care, and he ordered Keltron to take care of it himself, in his opinion. It was the king's duty to protect the defenseless, and he had no time for insignificant matters. Soon on the western outskirts of the capital, Ratslin, the kingdom of Jackson Guard, Sean and his companions stood near an old house, realized that he had bought the house after all, and he warned them that they would attract attention if they stayed in the inn for too long. This house was to be their temporary base of operations, and Xenon agreed that he was right. But he still wanted to object, and Sean was surprised that there was some problem with that. Xenon did not understand how the protagonist could stay in such a dump, and exclaimed that if he knew, he would sell his house to buy something better. Cheon ignored his cries, and simply decided that they go through. Once they were inside, he noticed that it was not as bad as he thought. They need to clean up, but before Sion could continue his reasoning, Xenon exclaimed that this place was cursed, so they could not stay here any longer. He threw Elite and the protagonist out of the house since they were distracting him from cleaning. The next moment, he screamed, emitting magical energy in order to speed up, and began to clean up. Alita supposed that this was not what normal cleaning sounded like, but she and Sean did not interfere. Soon everything was ready. When the protagonist and Alita entered the house, it was much more often than before in Xenon's opinion. The squalor was still there, but now it was not so terrible to walk here. Sean found this amazing, and Xenon added that the only thing missing was furniture. Suddenly he noticed a dirty spot, and was horrified by it, and the protagonist wondered why he was obsessed with frequency. Alita realized that spitting on the floor was the most effective tactic in the fight against Xenon. In the end, Sean admitted that it was a good job, and it was not bad for a start. Now that they had a base, they could prepare for the fight against